Here we go. So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Kyle Klaus. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications here at Skills for Chicagoland's Future. We're thrilled to have Dr. Annelies Goger joining us for her topic here, creating a quality job experience, all about the Great Reshuffle. And she'll actually define what that means for everybody. So once again, thank you on behalf of Skills for joining us today. We're excited that you were able to make it. A little about Dr. Goger. Dr. Annelies Goger is an economic geographer focused on developing innovative policy solutions to address rising inequality and increase access to economic opportunity. She's an expert in U.S. workforce development, policy, global supply chains, and inclusive economic development. Dr. Goger's work has challenged the dominant skills gap narrative, arguing that building stronger education and labor market institutions and making long-term investments in talent development are the key to unleashing regional innovation and addressing racial, gender inequities in the labor market. Dr. Goger's current research focuses on digital transformation in labor and education data systems, the employer role in talent development, and state credentialing policies that recognize diverse forms of learning, closing that opportunity gap for displaced hospitality workers and returning citizens. She's a member of the Better Employment and Training Strategies Task Force, a coalition that focuses on modernizing America's outdated and equitable workforce policies. Before coming to Brookings, Dr. Goger was with the Social Policy Research Associates and IMPAQ International. Dr. Goger is a Fulbright Scholar in Sri Lanka and Social Science Research Council Fellow. You might have seen Dr. Goger's work being published in numerous journals and books across the globe, and her work has been prominently featured on CNN, NPR, Washington Monthly, The Hill, along with numerous other podcasts, and now Skills for Chicagoland's Future's webinar here. So we're excited that she's joined us. If you attended Skills' Employment Champions Breakfast last year, you probably also saw Dr. Goger speak and were able to understand a little bit more about her work and the impressive stuff that she's doing as well. So we're thrilled to have her here. I will stop talking now and pass the floor over to you, Annelies.
Thanks so much, Kyle, for such a great introduction. And it's a real honor to be here before you today. And what I'm really hoping to do is draw on that previous talk a bit more, which was only like 15 minutes, and give you all some time to engage with it and ask questions. So there will be lots of time for that. And I think Kyle will start off with a few, and then, just keep your questions on cue for the discussion section. So I'm going to share my screen here. And presentation mode. There we go. So what I'm going to do to elaborate on what I shared last fall is talk a bit more. A lot of people talk nowadays about quality jobs and the Great Reshuffle. That's kind of dominating the conversation. And so I wanted to do is kind of bridge the talk from last time about the opportunity gap instead of a skills gap, and really go into, well, what does that mean in terms of creating, if you're an employer, creating a quality job experience? What are the kinds of things that you should be thinking about, and why is it important as an employer to be thinking about quality jobs for your own sake, not just because this is a charity thing, but actually delivering high road quality jobs as a way to be competitive in a really tight, challenging labor market. And so this is the title of the talk from last time, which I won't, go over in depth, but the argument here is that we often tend to focus on what people don't have when they apply for a job and call it a skills gap. And my colleague Luther Jackson and I argued that instead we should be thinking about what are we doing to create a level playing field so that more people have the opportunity to gain the kinds of skills and experience that can make them competitive to an employer in the labor market? And what can employers do to help co-create that talented and qualified labor pool? So we talked a lot about shifting the narrative away from things like just focusing on what an individual doesn't have to what are the ecosystems of partners that I should be engaging to make sure that I'm reaching talent that I may not be normally reaching, and that I'm also engaging partners to help cultivate talent and help people continue to learn in the workplace. And then moving from from a deficit focus of what someone doesn't have to what are the kind of assets that they can bring to the table and that could actually add to my team in a way because they're bringing new experiences new ideas about markets and how to reach them that I don't already have, and how that could benefit the company. And that it's not really about charity, but actually investing in people is a way to generate shared prosperity. Because as I shared in our last talk, some Harvard researchers found that if we had invested more equally in talent, we would quadruple the rate of innovation in the US. And to me, what that means is that there's a lot of talent out there that hasn't been activated, that we're not reaching, and they're not setting up for success. And the more we can do to do that, then the better off we'll be as a country, and not just as regions or for individuals and families, but actually as a country as a whole. So today I'm going to talk about the Great Reshuffle, and then I'm going to talk about what that might mean for rethinking hiring and rethinking talent development once someone is hired. So I'm sure all of you have heard the word the Great Reshuffle. And initially, this was actually the Great Resignation. And it was this idea that during the pandemic, not only were a lot of people laid off, actually historically high levels of people who were laid off, but people also started to quit their jobs en masse. And there's a lot of reasons for this. But what I wanted to talk about is how this sort of mass leaving of one job and finding of another can actually be a really process full of friction, in the sense that it can take someone, when they leave one job or they get laid off, to find another job that's a quality job that they want to keep. It can actually take quite a long time. And I think that's playing into some of the challenges that employers are finding in trying to find and rehire and cultivate a workforce. I also think it's important to think about what types of jobs are people leaving and what types of jobs are they going to. And there's also, again, like many reasons for that. The figures here on the very left and very right are the change in employment since February 2020, so pre-pandemic. And so what you're seeing here is a shift, generally speaking, from government to private sector. So that might include things like school teachers that were laid off during COVID when schools closed, childcare centers, et cetera. Healthcare and hospitality and leisure, no surprise there. We're still not back. This is all based on the July 8th BLS reports and the employment situation. So we're still pretty far down on hospitality and leisure. And where are they going to? Well, they're going more into the private sector. They're also going into things like professional and business services. So becoming consultants, working for consultancies, working in things like, if you had Netflix or Zoom that took off during the pandemic when people were at home, those types of digital industries are really had a big period of hiring. In addition, people are ordering everything online and getting groceries delivered. And so you see huge surges in transportation and warehousing in the pandemic. Also kind of not as shocking, but I think it's like a big shift in what I mean by reallocation from one set of industries to another. Another thing that we start to see, and we can talk about this in Q&A, is that one of the reasons that people are doing this is because, for example, if you are a mother with a child under 5 and you can't find childcare, then you might be more inclined to do something like freelancing or driving on your own time when you have the time to do it, than to get a job where you're required to be there certain hours. And so that flexibility to be able to determine your schedule has been pretty essential for a lot of parents who are still dealing with, classroom closures periodically due to COVID exposure. The other thing is that you're seeing with the tight labor market, as things start to the economy recovered, is that people are, seeing that there are all these openings that are unfilled and they can get a better wage, and they can actually, and most workers get better pay, not by advancing within their own company, but actually by going to a different one. So that also says something in terms of HR management systems and their ability to kind of keep up with these types of trends. Another thing that's really changed is that there have been a lot of business starts in the pandemic. And one of the factors underlying this is unemployment insurance was at a level where people that had always wanted to start a business or wanted to break out on their own, they actually had a little bit of a safety net there that would allow them to do that and to take that risk. And many of those folks were responding to some of the changes in the demand in the economy for e-commerce, for example, the online services or help desk services, and things like construction. As people were, remodeling their home in the pandemic, a lot of those industries really picked up, and there just weren't enough contractors out there to meet the demand. So people are responding to that. So you see a lot of these businesses in the same areas where you saw employment growing as well in the pandemic. So if we try to look back and take a big picture of this, I'm going to make the argument that a lot of these trends that we're seeing in the labor market are not cyclical, and in fact are now more structural. And the pandemic has had some short-term things that have made those structural factors more severe and more acute. But actually, underlying them are these very long-term, mostly demographic-driven changes in the labor market that are not going to go away anytime soon. And so what that actually means is that employers will need to play a larger role in co-producing qualified talent, especially because we haven't kept up those institutions to actually help people get into like earn and learn opportunities like apprenticeships and trades and things like that. And we've got baby boomers that have retired. So they for a long time have been staying in the workforce, but COVID accelerated that retirement. And so you have this massive wave of a very large pool of labor that is leaving the workforce, and many for good. And the folks that are coming in to replace them are generally much younger and much more diverse and less likely to have access to a college degree per se, or that degree is something that they want to get, but they can't afford it as yet. So they might be working on it as they work. And so what this means for employers is they have to kind of recalibrate their whole approach to talent. And I think, contributing to this are these issues that like immigration during the COVID, experts say that around 2 million people would have immigrated, half of whom would have a college degree level. Those folks have not immigrated. So there's a shortage there. There have actually been around I think it's 256,000 deaths of prime age working people due to COVID, and then the long COVID disability that's impacted the labor force. And again, as I mentioned earlier, lack of childcare continues to rear its head. And the friction that we're seeing just from the pure scale of people that were laid off or quit their jobs and then are trying to find a new one. So in the long term, what am I talking about? And I talked about retirement already. There's also a long-term trend in declining labor force participation. Maybe that's because more people are getting passive income from other sources like real estate or Airbnb, putting their place on Airbnb, that kind of thing. There's also a persistent uneven investment in talent and discrimination and stigma. So you still see pretty high levels of racial discrimination, gender discrimination, and stigma over things like a conviction record that is pretty widespread in the labor market. And this is keeping large pools of talent out of action on the sidelines. Over reliance on college degrees. A lot of employers in their job descriptions, they just require a college degree as a default without really thinking through to what extent is this really necessary for this job? And I think that's an important question to start to ask. And finally, as new technologies roll out into healthcare and construction and every field and industry is becoming more reliant on tech for different types of tasks. And so the workers also will need to have familiarity and comfort with those tools. And also have some kind of protections in terms of their identity and cybersecurity and fraud. And these are things that are really hitting lots of jobs and industries at the moment that we may not be quite prepared for, nor do we have a labor force that could do that type of work. So if people are starting businesses and retiring, and we don't have immigrants and so on, and women are stuck in jobs where they can control their schedule because they're still getting class shut down, then where will workers come from, right? So we have all kinds of things coming down from the infrastructure bill, from ARPA. We want to invest in these things. There's public money flowing, but where are the workers going to come from, right? So we have pretty low unemployment and participation. So one group that we might want to think about are the long-term unemployed. And there you might want to go and look at folks that, for example, took a break from the labor market because they were raising children or caring for an elder, or people who were not working because they were incarcerated, et cetera. So these are groups of people that don't have a lot of experience and they need to help getting back into that. They need that first job. And in my talk, I also highlighted some other groups that employers could consider targeting and thinking of crafting a strategy for recruitment and retention around, including returning citizens. A lot of those hospitality workers, maybe they're getting tired of that warehouse job or whatever it is that they have shifted into. How could you make your jobs attractive to that worker? I think it requires actually talking to them and finding out. And then looking in terms of, like, if you're trying to attract Black or Latino or Hispanic workers to your firm, do you have leaders and managers that are from those populations, so that when you are recruiting someone, they feel like, they're not the only ones in the workforce, and they have mentors that they can relate to that look like them, or that also goes for women in fields like tech, for example. And then younger workers, older workers, I'll talk about in a minute. So when we look at the data, you look at the people that are out of the labor force who don't want to work. The data from March 2021 to 2022 suggests that the younger workers actually do want to come back to work, 16 to 24 in particular. And who doesn't? It's the ones that are 55 plus. So I think this should help. It's not that one shouldn't target older workers. In fact, they might actually be really key for like part-time mentoring roles if you are bringing in young talent. But really, where the interest and demand for work is coming from is that youngest group, actually. And as I said in the last talk, that young group is majority Black or Hispanic and Latino. So this is the Chicago area's census data of those under 15, right? So that younger generation is a lot more diverse. They might live in a different community than the baby boomer who retired. So what does all this mean for hiring? And I think really what it's going to take is thinking through this entire process from start to finish, and re-examining some of the things that you might have gotten used to as an employer, as a hiring manager, and really thinking, well, maybe I don't know what I thought I know, because this is a different population, has different life experiences, and maybe they communicate with each other differently, like on social media. So that means looking beneath just college grads. It means finding those new modes of outreach, testing out what works, testing different messaging, doing some focus groups with folks and finding out, how do they find out about job postings, and where could you put a job ad in front of them that they'll find. Maybe they don't go on LinkedIn. And what would make a package attractive to them? So a lot of focus in the news has been on wages, and that is a pretty big deal. But actually, for a lot of people, you could pay them a lot of money, but if it's a toxic workplace with, people where they feel kind of alienated, they're not going to stay very long. So even if that wage attracts them in the door, it's important to think long-term about, am I creating a welcoming culture for a diverse workforce? That is the group that I need to recruit. And then at the application stage, I think employers should be going through their old job descriptions. And then I've actually interviewed some that were doing just this and saying, oh, I was requiring this, but this might be more of a preferred. Because research suggests that women and people of color tend to be less likely, if they think that, oh, I don't have this requirement or this requirement, I'm not going to apply, but white males will. And so how do you overcome that sort of difference in behavior? Well, you make a lot more things optional, so people don't get the message that this is required and I have to have it or I won't have a chance, right? So it's thinking through the language, making sure that you're not using jargon that someone new to your field or new to the labor market might not be familiar with. And taking things like a background check, and instead of doing a blanket background check, doing some time up front to say, well, if it's a driver position, I don't want a DUI, but there might be other records that would be okay in that role. Vice versa, if it's a teacher, like, there are other records that you really wouldn't want for that person, but maybe there are records that you can overlook. And those are kind of decisions that have to come up as a job by job thing. Researchers have found what hasn't made a whole lot of difference is years and years of experience. So there is a tendency to overemphasize experience and college degrees, and say you need 2 years of experience. And I interviewed an employer once, in their job descriptions, it said, this is for an assembly role, you need 2 years experience in medical device manufacturing assembly. I was like, well, who's going to have that if they're trying to enter the job market for the first time? So is that really required? What if you said 2 years of experience in the workforce or in assembly of some kind? That would open your door a lot more to a bigger pool of people. And like I said, there's a lot of difference in who decides whether they're going to apply if something seems on the fence of whether they're actually qualified or not. In the evaluation period, if you're doing the interviews and then deciding which candidates to select, there's also a bunch of things to think through. There's recent research that confirms that structured interviews are best because you're asking the same questions of everyone. And so it's a bit more fair in terms of what information you're pulling out. And really not zooming in on those degrees, but like what are ways you can demonstrate to me what skills you have, what your talent is, what the things that you are good at are. And so if someone has a record, for example, you could ask them, show me evidence that you have rehabilitated yourself. And I have friends that I know who are advocates in that space. They'll show you like a stack of papers this high of all the things they did in their rehabilitation. And when you can see that versus someone that can offer you that, that's a better, way to judge, like, is this person putting in the time and putting in the effort rather than do you have a record or not? So basically, a lot of these don't discount people off of a surface thing, like how they're showing up per se. Dig a little under the surface and find out what are they good at and how would they fit this job opening? Because if you bring your preconceived ideas of what someone should look like and shouldn't have in terms of a degree or a record or whatever, you're making a lot of assumptions and you're probably ruling out people that would be really excelling in that job. And then doing job demonstrations is also pretty good. And I think it's important to think up front about salary equity and transparency, because there's also evidence that suggests that women in particular don't negotiate as much as men in salary negotiations, and that contributes to the pay gap. And I can speak from personal experience here because I actually left one of my jobs because when I discovered that my male counterparts with less experience made a lot more money than me, I was pretty angry and I ended up trying to negotiate for it, but then left the job. So your retention may not stay if you're not thinking systematically about equity and transparency in pay across, race, gender, ethnicity, etc. And finally, a lot of people fixate on cultural fit in the hiring process. And actually, there's evidence that this actually is not a very good predictor of success. And a lot of evidence to the contrary, that the more different someone is, actually the better it is for innovation and for like inclusion and diversity in general. So I would actually take that off the list. And then finally, peer support. When you go into the onboarding process, it's really important to be thoughtful about this person's entree into your company. So again, if I'm the only woman in the room on my team, it's going to be a really different experience than if my supervisor is a woman or my bigger boss above that is a woman, or there's 3 other women on the team. There's a little bit of peer interaction going on where I feel supported and welcome. But if I'm the only one, then like it may be pretty intimidating to me. So thinking about hiring in cohorts and establishing like peer networks within the organization, or really thinking clearly about mentorship relationships up ahead and really introducing them when someone first starts. Another thing that's important are feedback loops. So making sure that you're getting lots of feedback, because this is, again, if you're used to working with one population that's like an older baby boomer population, and now you're working with someone who's 18 years old, has very different life experience, very different, maybe they live in a different community. You have to take the time to like gather their input in response to a lot of things, because you can't just kind of operate on autopilot in that situation. And so a lot of it is making sure that people feel like their voice is being heard. And as a first gen person, I can say that making unwritten rules within the workplace more transparent can really benefit a lot of people that are really new to the workplace. There's a lot of norms and codes that are, Greek to someone that doesn't have a parent who worked in an office setting or who worked in a given industry setting. And so when you're transferring between industry cultures, it's important to acknowledge that the norms you have are not necessarily the same ones that the person's coming in with. And you have to make those rules and codes of conduct and like, this is what we expect of you to succeed, make that transparent in the beginning. And then finally, career ladders and learning systems come together in the sense that mobility is really key to a quality job, and learning systems help formalize the opportunities that people have to keep learning and developing in their job, and help the employer keep track of how someone is progressing around certain competencies that they want them to achieve. And similarly, having articulated ladders where people have both horizontal and vertical ways that they can move within the organization if they get tired of one job. Not being in a dead end job and feeling trapped is a pretty big priority for Gen Z. So I think it's important to communicate, this is where you can go with this job. And if you want to like develop in a new way, here are the offerings we can offer you. And then finally, retention and support is critical if you're talking about people just coming back into the labor force or who are new to the labor force. Sometimes they might not have a stable housing situation or transportation that could cause them to be late for something that they don't want to be late for, but they have no car yet and the train came late. So what kinds of coaching could you offer? Like, even if it's just like a resource they could go to if they need some help trying to find these types of resources to get to their job on time and keep their job. And, there's all kinds of other things that you could think about specific to specific populations. If it's people with disabilities, maybe part of the support for them would be some training you could do of other staff on what is the etiquette for working with people with disabilities, so that people in the staff are really well versed in, what is expected of them in terms of how they treat someone who has a disability. So like I said, I think, as I said in my talk last fall, it starts with listening to talent and figuring out what are their pain points, rather than assuming that what's holding someone back, and predetermining what you're offering to someone. And so I had shared this anecdote of how we talked to folks that were trying to get into tech who are from Oakland, and generally either women or people of color. And these are some of the barriers that they shared with us. And so you can think, if you're in HR, you can start to think like, well, if they're feeling like they don't have a lot of information and professional networks, like maybe you could engage with some local organizations where you get in front of talent that is looking, if there's an organization that has a career network for tech, if you send one of your HR people to participate in that network, then that can give you access to talent that's really seeking that information, and you can help close that information gap. So that's just one example of, how you can use this feedback that you get from talent to sort of think through what that means for your recruitment strategy or the packages that you can offer them. Like maybe you bring them in without a degree, but you help them figure out how they can earn their degree while they're working, either through like a degree apprenticeship or just a degree program that's related to the job. All right, so beyond hiring, there's also the question of talent development and including retention and management. In the last fall's talk, I presented this sort of nerdy graphic, and I wanted to take a little bit more time to go into it, and I know I'm running short, so I have about 5 more minutes, but I will try to make it quick. So my point here, in a nutshell, is that a lot of employers in the United States, compared to other countries where I've interviewed employers, they tend to think about talent investment as a cost and not as an expense, right? And that's partly because of accounting reasons, but not including the investment payout, the return on investment that comes out of that cost, whether that's reduced turnover or whether that's productivity enhancements, right? They may come a little bit later than the window of time that you're monitoring for costs and expenditures. So the idea around apprenticeship and how it compares to an internship is that the longer it is, the more actually the employer benefits from that apprenticeship, because that first period, if you see on in this graph, the beginning part is when the employer is putting a lot of time into that person's onboarding, right? So I have a new employee, I've been spending a lot of time training him up and I don't get a lot out of him yet. But at some point, I'm going to reach that inflection point and he's going to do better, and I have to spend less time with him, and he's going to run with things, and and then the machine will be going. And so the idea here is that the longer the period, the more you recruit the investment. This is how it works in countries like Switzerland and Germany, where they have a better ROI on talent investments through apprenticeship. And so I wanted to just highlight how this emphasis on like creating that learning culture in this time period, if it's longer and gives someone a longer runway, it actually is beneficial for the ROI of the employer, because they're still getting that apprentice wage, even though it goes up as they get more experience. And this is just an example of IBM's learning management system, which allows their employees to like do little digital badges to advance their learning, and then offers kind of like a Netflix of training where you say, you did this digital badge. How about these 3? And so it creates this sort of game-like way of encouraging people to do more learning. And that's just one example of many companies that have been investing in these types of systems. And I also mentioned last time that diversity in leadership is really critical. It's critical for being competitive in the labor market to get and attract and retain talent. It's also critical for innovation revenue. So companies with below average diversity scores do worse in their innovation revenue. So diversity isn't about charity. It actually adds value in a lot of respects. And then I just want to emphasize once more that constant feedback is critical for, especially when you're working with diverse populations. You can't assume that you understand what it is that somebody wants. And I will end here on this slide about what is a quality job. So it's not just about wages, although family sustaining wages are important for job security and to keep people and to attract people. But it's way more than that, right? People want a place where they feel respected, where they can grow and move and develop and feel like they're contributing. And so to the degree that employers can really think about this, I think well into the future, that this long-term perspective about talent and measuring not just the initial investment in talent development, but the payoff in terms of retention and revenue and so on, it's important to measure those things to assess yourself on those things. So that's it. And I will stop sharing so we can have a conversation.
Cool. Thank you so much, Dr. Goger. There was so much in there. I know I have questions. I'm sure others do as well. So I will just kind of kick things off, but if anyone else has questions, feel free to just kind of popcorn around. You can put it in the chat. We'll get to those as well. But feel free to just unmute yourself and we can just kind of popcorn around with some questions. First, Dr. Goger, I feel remiss to not bring up another R. You mentioned the Great Reshuffle that's going on. Recession seems to be the key topic on everyone's mind as you watch the news, you open a newspaper, whatever it might be, you go on Twitter. So while it still feels very much like an employee-powered labor market right now, curious, do you think there will be any impact on this Great Reshuffle if we do go into recession, or in your opinion, are we currently in one?
Well, I don't think we are in one now if you look at the jobs reports, but I do think that some parts of the tightness are cyclical and would shift in a recession. But I also think that, I was advocating that we have to take the long-term view about talent. So in the United States, compared to most European countries, actually, we jumped to layoffs really quick. And we did that in COVID, and there were a lot of them. And now they can't hire people back because, like, once you've been burned, like, it really erodes morale and, like, contributes to more people quitting, actually, the evidence suggests. And so what I want to offer is that also, what most countries do is a program called Work Share, which I think should be a national thing, but it's only in about half of the states, where you can actually reduce someone's hours and then they get unemployment compensation for the lost hours, and then they get paid for the hours they still work. So temporarily you reduce you reduce your whole team's hours, and then you keep them in place. That's one of the reasons why Germany did so well out of the Great Recession in 2008, 2009, because they didn't let people go. They retained that talent and the people that know what they're doing, and you don't have to onboard, right? So they had them in the wings and they hadn't cut the cord, so to speak. And so I think we need to think about tools like that in managing how we respond to cycles more. And I think employers in manufacturing are pretty aware of work share programs, but beyond that, they're not actually utilizing those types of programs to the same level that I think they should if you're really thinking about talent retention.
Thank you. Here's one that was put in the chat. The labor market is changing again. Construction, commerce, and retail seem to be slowing. Also, employers are starting new employees at lower wages. Are we heading to a different market correction?
I don't have a crystal ball, but I will say we have a lot of infrastructure dollars coming soon. And that's going to be keeping things like construction and utilities and broadband jobs pretty open. And I worry the opposite, that they won't be able to find people to fill those positions. And I think that, it's cyclical patterns in the economy happen. And it's really a question of how do we actually respond to them? But in the long run, it doesn't go away that baby boomers are moving out and replacing them are young people. So in my view, if we do hit a recession, a lot of young people, when they get laid off, will go back to college in that time or go to law school or whatever they had as a education goal. And so as an employer, maybe that's a time where maybe you do you reduce someone's hours on one hand, but you create opportunities for someone to do some learning modules on the side when they're not working, and you're reducing their hours so that they're coming back actually more geared up for their job.
If anyone else has questions, feel free to jump in, or I will just keep asking them. So feel free to just unmute yourself, raise your hand, put it in the chat, whatever works. But in the meantime, Annelies, you did mention on that slide that 59% of young people in the Chicago MSA are Black or Latino or Hispanic. Do you see businesses needing to adapt in certain ways to accommodate this future workforce, at least in our region?
Absolutely. And I talked a little bit about generally listening to talking to people, finding out what would make something attractive. But think about some examples, right? So if before you had a baby boomer who had their own car and lived in a suburb, maybe now you're dealing with someone coming from a different community where they don't have a car. And so, but would you know that if you're doing just regular hiring and retention stuff, right? Unless you ask, why didn't you show up, on time today or whatever it is, you have to ask and you have to figure out okay, maybe there's going to be a lot of different demands from employers to try to help deal with those types of issues. Like transportation is a really common one, or childcare is another one. Or let's say, your whole family gets COVID and you need flexibility on, being able to take paid sick time. So these are things that I think would make a big difference. But again, you can't assume on the outright what it is that's you see a behavior, and dig underneath it to find out what is causing this behavior instead of like making assumptions that you might have made with an older workforce that you were more used to working with.
Laura, it looked like you had a question. Do you mind, I know you put it in the chat. Do you mind just
I
asking
have
you?
about a million questions, but that's pretty normal. I think the one that I would love your insights on are we see all over like the internet how inflation and wages are a hot topic and how the cost of housing and cost of education have not kept up with wages. So I'm trying to wrestle with what employers can do to address inflation, address wages while margins are shrinking.
Yeah, and it's hard to speak across industries because it's very industry specific. But if you're talking about corporate jobs, there's actually evidence that their profit margins are not shrinking. And so there is a different issue there. When you're talking about small businesses, to me, that goes also has personal significance. My dad is a small business. I think that, for 40 years, we have really had this sort of laissez-faire approach to our economy. And a lot of small businesses are struggling after that because a lot of what's happened as a result is a consolidation of many supply chains. And so those smaller players are seeing their margins squeezed and their market power has decreased. So to me, as a government policy person, I think we should be investing more in small business supports. And I think that small business leaders need to be working together more and leveraging things like chambers of commerce and associations to really share some of the costs associated with talent investment, with recruitment, with HR. Like most small businesses don't have HR staff, they can't afford that, right? So there's a role for government, I think, in creating the table that they need to sit at to make some of these shared investments. But I also think it takes the leadership of those small companies to find some cost sharing things. Like maybe if you shared costs and got together as a group, you could get a lower health insurance quote, right? We don't have a long tradition in this country of doing that, but in countries where these types of earn and learn investments work best, they already have these institutions of employers that are really active in sharing that. Like they'll have a shared training center that they all group together and pay for an instructor rather than having to take one on in yourself.
Thanks, Laura. Iom, I think you had one. Do you want to ask yours?
I do. Thanks, Kyle. And thank you for this discussion so far. This one sort of looks at our partners who are also on the call. So there are organizations on this webinar that focus on supporting unemployed job seekers or talent. Do you have any thoughts or recommendations from the job seeker side to utilize this current moment, right? The reshuffling, right? To our advantage, right? Is there something that we could be doing differently that it's sort of like, it's so clear, but we're not doing anything with it, right? So just curious about what your thoughts might be there.
Yeah, I think that for job seekers and especially long-term unemployed, any kind of experience that you can get on your resume, like any type of, even if it's volunteer experience, although a lot of people don't have the luxury of that, but just even if it's part-time, like getting yourself in the workplace, building your professional networks is absolutely critical. So I recommend that people do informational interviews in the field they want to enter and just, constantly get direct insights from people in that field. And then also, put themselves in that space, whether it's going to events or volunteering, or you want to be part of that ecosystem, because then you pick up on information and how people talk and what the norms are and how you should dress and, what openings are coming out. And you might find out about openings before everyone else. So it's getting yourself into that circle as in any way that you can. And that's really what I encourage people to do, is not sit on the sidelines and really do what you can to meet people. And because the information gap is real, and most people find jobs through someone they know. And if you don't know anyone, it's a real barrier.
Yep. If I may, so sometimes it can feel like we're sort of collectively on cruise ships, right? These are big ships to turn, right? So I'm really thinking about your one slide when you sort of had the arrows pointing from where demand was to where it is now. And so I'm going to stay here, if I may, right, to sort of maybe see if there's some guidance, right? If you were talking to, 100+ organizations, which Skills can and does do, right? How might you guide us all, right? And thinking about or tracking sort of where the markets are going, right? I guess I'm looking for like what silver bullet, right? Data source, or who can we be following, or how can we collectively sort of rally around where the markets are going when you're thinking about folks, to your point that you've raised very well, which is, look, we seem to be shifting to skills-based hiring, right? And so how do we sort of wrap all this up into one cohesive sort of 2 to 3 year strategy for making sure that talent, right, is pointed in the right direction?
That's a great question. So off the top of my head, I would say have diverse leaders in place. Like, you can say you're D&I, whatever, but if all your leaders are white men, like, you're not. And people will know that when you hire them. And so you have to kind of walk the walk in your leadership, I think, is one really key thing. And two, I think it means, I talked a bit about earn and learn, right? So college is very inaccessible for a lot of really smart, really talented people because it's so expensive and you have to go into so much debt. So thinking strategically about how could you offer people the ability to either earn that degree while they're working, or do an apprenticeship where you get a degree, a non-traditional apprenticeship. Those are some of the most innovative things that I'm seeing. And not only is it good for that learner, but when I interview employers, a lot of times what I hear is, I don't really want that MIT grad in this job because they're overqualified and they're going to leave in a year because they're not satisfied. And I don't really want just the degree from MIT, computer science, whatever. Like, I actually need someone who has a combination of, they know my industry, they know, like, this was in agriculture, this was in like berry production, right? So they need some people that understand how to apply like tools like AI into berry, harvest prediction models. So they need to know the problems of their industry. And the only way you do that is by getting the experience in industry. So it's that earn and learn blended model of sometime in the classroom, sometime on the job, that actually gives you that talent that knows your industry and knows the tech, and can actually compete in that middle space. And to me, that is a silver bullet, in the sense that we just tell everyone, go to college, and all your problems will be solved. But we're not building up that middle where someone is really gaining that practical work experience and problem solving exposure. And at the same time, teaching them all those unwritten rules about the workplace culture that they may not have been exposed to in their family or whatever. Because we have a history in our country of occupational segregation where you just end up doing what your parents did, right? Because we don't have those on-ramps into something. And then number 3, like, I do really think that it starts with like doing some real listening to target groups and find out what kind of packages, what kind of workplace do you want? And someone asked, I think in the chat, about hybrid, remote, right? Ask people, because I don't know, like, I can't answer for everyone. Some people want, some people need to have flexibility because they have small kids. Other people want to be in the workplace more and interacting with teams. And, it's all over the map. And I think it's still not well researched in terms of how preferences are evolving in the pandemic.
Thank you for that answer. We actually got one that's directed more towards skills, so we'll give you 1 second to take a breather here. Pam, our Chief Program Officer, is actually on the call. Pam, if you don't mind, I'm going to let you answer this one. But just given your aggregate knowledge of this, what is skills learned during the COVID, post-COVID time from our clients? Like, what are we hearing? Does it sound similar, different? Are we seeing some overlaps with what Dr. Goger talked about today?
Yeah, thanks, Kyle. Actually, it is pretty similar to what Dr. Gilger has been talking about. Specifically, as people are, struggling to find people for jobs, as people are, I think, starting to really look at what you spoke of in terms of skills-based hiring as opposed to degrees. I think that's what's changing that direction, and we're seeing a ton of momentum of employers going that way because they haven't been able to find jobs in that traditional way. So we've seen a number of those same things happening. Harder, we see a lot of part-time jobs as well. To your point of transportation, childcare, people needing to work when they need to work, and making sure that fits their schedule. So I think it's pretty similar.
Yeah, there's a lot of surveys showing that when people started their own businesses, because they wanted more autonomy and the ability to sort of shape what they're doing and when they're doing it and things like that. It's really a huge theme. Yeah. And one other group that I hear a lot more about that I tried to reference a few times in my talk are returning citizens. I think fair chance hiring is, not just an equity thing, like how do you really hire diverse workers, is you have to address that question because so many employers just blanket exclude people because they have a record. But actually, I was just having a lunch conversation with folks about how hard it is to clear a record. So even if your 10 years have passed or something's not illegal anymore, that record will linger and you continue to be weeded out from things, even if it's something like a marijuana conviction that's no longer legal in your state. And it continues to punish you from getting housing, getting jobs. And so really thinking in a real sophisticated way about fair chance talent, I think is something that a lot of employers are doing more of already, but there's a lot of need for how do you actually get from A to B to do that well?
Anyone else have any other questions they want to toss out there?
So Dr. Goger, the Workshare program, that is so cool. Are there any other policies like that don't really impact efficiency a ton that would be good to implement locally or federally?
Well, I think I mentioned, like I said, pooling talent, like community training centers and things like incubators, business incubators. I think it's important for businesses to have access to, especially if you're talking about women-owned or Black or Latino-owned businesses, where they may have less access to financing and less, resources like generational wealth to build on to start a business. I think that the more we can do I see, a lot of people are like business versus labor. Like I think actually inclusion starts with ownership and supporting ownership inclusion. And some of the models coming out of that too might be something like, shared ownership, like co-ops, like in Cleveland, you have that model. People want ownership. And I think it's because, and I have to say, like, I'm learning this myself as a first gen person. You can't earn a lot through wages anymore. You earn it by owning assets. And that's how you accrue wealth in our current economy. And I think people are clued into that, and they're really thinking about that more and more. And so we have this sort of old mentality that like work equals wage, but actually or wealth equals work hard and earn a wage, but actually more and more and more it's coming from, do you own a house? Do you have a business? What are your ownership assets? And that's where you actually generate wealth. So I push people a little bit on the wage thing sometimes, because I'm like, well, it has a pretty far way to go before it can compete with what people are seeing when they actually own assets. So.
All right, we got about 4 minutes left here. We're going to try to fit in 2 more questions. Susan, looks like you got one.
Yeah, I did. Thanks, Dr. Goger. Question for you is, I think that in talking to a lot of our employers, people are open for change in the way they find talent because the pain is pretty significant right now. So people are open to change. The problem comes in that change takes time. So I'm wondering if, while their pain is still going on, but the change, or at least I'd say on many times the human resources side, there's that openness. Do you have any examples or case studies or anything that you could share of companies inside the US that have really started to make those changes that others could look to that to say, this is how I've made the change, and then where you shared sort of those economic impacts that it had on retention or improved performance or that kind of thing, that really people can use to, I think, be that third party representative as they're trying to make that change inside their own organization?
Yeah, I think I mentioned IBM, and in addition to the learning management platform, which many companies have now, they went through their job descriptions and made about half of them not require a degree. I think I had a conversation with folks at, I think it was Indeed, that was also thinking along the same lines, like which of these positions do require a degree and which don't. And I think there's also a lot of headway on the fair chance hiring in tech in the Bay Area where I used to live. So Slack is leading like a coalition of tech employers that are really zooming in on fair chance hiring within tech and what that looks like, what kinds of positions, and then how does they're doing apprenticeships with a group called Next Chapter, which multiple employers work with them to do tech apprenticeships. And then in Chicago, you have lots of large companies that do apprenticeships quite well. You have Aon, right? And Accenture, and you have who else am I forgetting? So there's more and more interest, I think, in things like apprenticeship because we haven't built these sort of applied pathways in a really long time. And but it's hard to scale them when we don't have the infrastructure, like I said, for the small business to engage without incurring a lot of cost. And so what we really need is some institution. We need people to work together to be able to offer more in terms of learning and benefits and other things. So you can be competitive with those big corporations. That's one of my concerns, is that the big corporations win out with talent because they have more overhead to offer a lot more. And that's where I think more cooperation is in order.
Thank you.
So we had one, we'll do Karen's last question here in the chat because I think it's a good one to end on. What role do algorithms play? Are employers backing away from excluding candidates to more now broadening their search?
Algorithms are tricky because if you know anything about AI and how machine learning works, it imprints on previous data. So if you have, let's say, a financial consultant in a role in a company, it's going to take all the people in that role. And if they happen to be white males, then it'll start to find patterns that may be more attributable to the fact that they're white males than the fact that they're good at this job in financial consulting or whatever. And so my worry about the way AI works is it's regression toward the mean. And you could really easily develop biases for anyone that doesn't look like that mean that exists in that current job. And that's my issue with like higher view and things like that. That being said, there's also a lot of bias that comes into the interview process and the recruitment process. And so some advocates say that, well, we should, sometimes you get more diverse candidates from things like that. And I would argue that we really don't have, we don't have any monitoring infrastructure, government processes for you. It's like all a black box of like, how did this person get picked and that person not get picked? And that worries me a lot, because I think we need to do a lot more work on that side before I can openly embrace things like machine learning and hiring. And I honestly think that just doing more work to actually put your HR teams out in the community, talking to people, getting to know people, getting to know the groups that they're trying to recruit is the best way to build your ability to message to that group and be like create an attractive role for that person.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Goger. I appreciate it. And I think on behalf of everyone at Skills and probably everyone on this webinar, we've learned a lot. So I appreciate you taking the time, effort, and energy to put all this together. That last question did kind of, it sparked, honestly, what we do at Skills, right? Our goal is to expand that pool of talent for employers who are looking to hire. Specifically here in Chicago, we also have national expansion efforts underway across the country. So if anyone is interested in continuing this conversation, feel free to do so on social media. You can see here the different handles and hashtags and all that kind of fun stuff. Hopefully this is our first of many Skills lunch conversations that we'll have around different topics and sharing different information and really talking about what's important here, getting folks who are outside of the labor market inside of it, creating that equitable experience for anyone who's looking for work, and not only when they're in the job to be successful, but long-term in creating that generational wealth that will really start to move the markets and the individuals that we all work with. If you have any other questions, skills related or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me. You can see my email address on here. If you're an employer who's looking to potentially utilize Skills is expertise or experience on hiring from the unemployed and underemployed markets, Susan Dunthis is our Vice President of Client Service and Business Development, and we'll be happy to continue that conversation and dialogue as well. But again, thank you, Annelies. This has been awesome. It was great. The 10 minutes you gave us last year and the 30 minutes was even better. So thank you again for taking the time to engage with us and share all of your insights. Much appreciated.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to more conversations.
Thanks. And if any of your colleagues missed this, if you were on the call and you're like, "Ooh, it would have been great if somebody else heard this," we recorded this. So we'll also be sharing this and having a recap as well on our website. So more to come when that comes out. But thank you again.